My name is Sylvia, and I'm a 38-year-old housewife working part-time. My daughter, Melody, graduated from college last year and has moved out, so now I live with my 50-year-old husband, Victor. With Melody's departure, I find I have a bit more time on my hands these days. Victor and I met on a blind date and clicked immediately. Our relationship progressed quickly, and we were married not long after. We were soon blessed with a daughter. Even though it was my first experience with parenting, I was determined to give it my all. I left my job to become a full-time stay-at-home mom, handling all the housework and childcare on my own. Victor, however, wasn't supportive. When he finished work early, he would go out drinking, and on his days off, he preferred to entertain himself elsewhere. If he wasn't out, he'd simply lounge around in his room. His attitude was dismissive, as if housewives had an easy life and enjoyed living without contributing. His outdated perspective on my role often left me frustrated. I've considered divorce, of course, but I hesitated. I didn't want to end our marriage just because he was uncooperative and had a sharp tongue. I decided it would be better for my daughter if both parents stayed together, so I adjusted my perspective. I resolved to raise her on my own terms, relying on my husband only for his paycheck. This approach worked for a while, but things took a turn when my daughter started middle school. My husband began siphoning money from our household funds, claiming it was for company expenses or business entertainment. This resulted in considerable financial strain on the family. To help alleviate the pressure, I took on a part-time job. Despite my efforts, my husband continued to complain about everything. He belittled my work, dismissing it as insignificant because I was just a part-timer, and implied that any work a woman did was inherently easy. His lack of respect for women in general was clear, though I maintained a facade of compliance while silently planning to get my revenge. One cold winter night, the house phone rang. I answered to find it was my uncle on the other end. My mother's brother called to tell me that she had been rushed to the hospital by ambulance and was in critical condition. He gave me the name of the hospital, and I quickly prepared to leave. I woke up my husband, urging him to get the car ready so we could drive there. Since my father passed away a few years ago, my mother had been living alone. My father had been a strong, dependable man, and I cherished the memories of my mother smiling beside him. Even after his death, it felt like he was still there in spirit, watching over her. Now, faced with the possibility of losing my mother, I found it hard to believe. As I sat in the passenger seat, I prayed fervently for her to hold on. When we finally arrived at the hospital, my uncle and some other relatives were already there, waiting anxiously. According to what I heard, my mother had suddenly woken up in the middle of the night with severe chest pains. Torn about whether to call an ambulance, she first reached out to my uncle. After he strongly urged her to seek help, she finally called for an ambulance. My uncle, who lived nearby, quickly went to her house and accompanied her to the emergency room. He informed me of her situation as soon as he knew where they were taking her. I am deeply grateful to my uncle for his swift and compassionate assistance. When I arrived at the hospital, I found my mother unconscious in her bed, unable to speak to her. I called out to her, but there was no response. The doctor who examined her explained that her condition was critical, and it would be some time before we could know more. My relatives and I gathered around, calling out to her and offering words of encouragement. Amidst this, we began discussing the arrangements that would need to be made. Suddenly, I heard a voice of frustration. It was my husband, complaining loudly, it's finally over. You woke me up in the middle of the night and wasted my time. Let's just go home." It was my husband's voice I heard, and when I looked over, I saw him sitting in the corner of the room, clearly frustrated. In the midst of my worry for my mother, I had forgotten he was there. I turned to him and said, "Please go home. You don't need to stay." Though my mother was unconscious, I worried that she might hear his harsh words. I didn't want him to add any more distress to the situation. Ignoring my plea, he grumbled loudly. "So she made me waste my time for what? She doesn't even have much money to leave behind. She was just a useless old hag until the end, wasn't she?" His words were hurtful and deeply disrespectful. After he left, my relatives, who had been worried about me, gathered around. I took a deep breath, calmed myself, and thanked them for their support. I assured them I was all right and that I had decided to divorce him. I returned home just as my husband was leaving for work, feeling a mix of relief and resolve. I immediately packed a box with clothes and essentials and delivered it to my uncle's house before leaving home with my personal belongings. To be honest, I had been secretly planning to divorce my husband when he reached retirement age in a few years. However, his callous comments at the hospital made me speed up my decision. I couldn't bear to live under the same roof as someone who would speak so disrespectfully about my mother. For the time being, I took a room at a business hotel and reached out to the lawyer I had been consulting. That night, my husband called my cell phone. "Hey, what's going on at home? Your mom's still in the hospital, right? You don't have to take care of her, do you? The funeral isn't even set yet. Why don't you come home and cook dinner?" I replied firmly, "Please leave me alone. I won't be coming home anymore, Victor. I'm divorcing you." He snickered and responded dismissively, "If you can do it, go ahead. You're just a housewife with a part-time job." Then he hung up. A few days later, however, he called again, but this time his tone was completely different. "What are these divorce papers and alimony demands?" His voice was filled with impatience. I remained calm and replied, "As I said, I'm divorcing you, and the alimony is justified for the mental anguish I've suffered because of you." "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "I've endured your constant complaints." I calmly explained, "I've documented everything you've said and done in my diary and on my blog." My lawyer said this would be strong evidence. He seemed taken aback, clearly unaware that I had been preparing for this divorce behind his back. "What evidence?" he asked, confused. I responded firmly that any further communication regarding the divorce would need to go through my lawyer and ended the call. Shortly thereafter, my husband and I finalized the divorce. Our savings of $200,000 were divided. Since his share was equal to the amount of alimony for the emotional distress, we agreed that I would receive the full amount of the savings. Naturally, my husband resisted the terms from the start. "There's no such thing as a wife's share," he argued. "I earned that money. If you're taking over your useless mother's house, then that's mine too." Each time, my lawyer calmly explained the situation to him, pointing out that pursuing mediation or court would be costly. By emphasizing the potential legal fees, my lawyer managed to quiet my husband's objections. When everything was finally settled, my ex-husband bitterly complained, "You took all my money. How could you?" My lawyer looked at me with a pained expression and voiced his concerns about my well-being, though his words offered no comfort. To me, my ex's complaints felt like the desperate cries of a defeated man. Less than 2 months after the divorce was finalized, my mother passed away. I organized her funeral with the help of my relatives. Shortly after, I received a call from my uncle and his wife. They wanted to see me as soon as possible. I felt a bit nervous as I arrived at the restaurant to meet my uncle and his wife. Once seated, my uncle wasted no time getting straight to the point. I received a call from Victor asking to borrow money, he began. "Given the circumstances of your divorce, I would have hung up on him immediately, but my wife answered the phone instead." "Yes, I was the one who spoke to Victor," his wife confirmed. "I was aware of the situation between you and Victor, including his outburst in the hospital room. I had no intention of lending him any money, but I was curious about what he had to say. I pretended to be sympathetic and asked him why he needed the money, acting as though I was fooled." "Why did he need money, though?" I asked, puzzled. My uncle explained, "Even though you got the couple's savings after the divorce, Victor still had a job and should have been earning enough. However, he's been gambling away his paycheck. When he ran short, he started borrowing from consumer credit companies. Naturally, he ran out of money, and his salary was being garnished. When his boss found out, he was let go. Victor took early retirement?" I said, astonished. "What a mess. But didn't he receive severance pay even though he retired early?" My uncle nodded. Yes, he did receive severance pay, which was actually an advance payment system. It was added to his salary and bonus a long time ago. The severance pay he received in advance was based on what he would have earned if he had worked until the official retirement age. Since he retired early, he had to repay the difference when he left. I was surprised. I didn't know he was taking advantage of the advance payment plan. I vaguely remember that he stopped showing me his pay stubs at some point. I'm sure that's when he started using that system. My uncle's wife added, "So after I listened to Victor, I told him, 'Oh my gosh, let me talk to my husband about this.' And then I hung up. It was quite entertaining." Later, I discovered that my ex-husband hadn't only called my uncle, but had reached out to all my relatives, asking them for money. How could any of my relatives lend him money? I thought, Even those who attended the wake and farewell ceremony knew about his outbursts in the hospital. I have no sympathy for my ex-husband. I guess he's run out of people to turn to. One day, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, I heard my ex-husband's voice, a voice that sounded different from when we were married. It gave me goosebumps. "Hey, it's been a while. How's everything?" he asked. I replied, "I went to your mom's house recently. They're doing construction. Are you planning to live in it after the renovation?" "No," I said. "I'm renting it out. To be honest, I would have lived there myself. But since my ex-husband knew the location, I thought it might be dangerous, so I decided against it." I wasn't about to give him the full backstory. "Where are you living now?" he asked. "I'd never tell you. Well, it's a condo with a concierge at the entrance, so you can't just walk in," I replied. "A condo?" My ex-husband sounded stunned. It was no wonder. I had inherited a fortune from my mother that far exceeded the alimony I received. The story dates back to when my father passed away a few years ago. He was a tax accountant, and during his illness, he had asked a colleague in his profession to handle my mother and my inheritance. I had been concerned about my ex-husband's money management skills even before my father's death. To protect my inheritance, I had offered to disinherit my mother and claim my father's large estate without my ex-husband's knowledge. When my ex-husband inquired about my father's inheritance, I lied, telling him that it was negative due to the mortgage on the house and that I had renounced it. He seemed easily convinced and stopped asking about it. Now, having inherited everything from my mother, my assets were secure from him due to our divorce. My mother was a modest woman who preferred high-quality, simple clothing that lasted. I believe my ex-husband assumed she was poor and had no idea about my financial situation or my plans. I had no intention of informing him. He continued, "If you can afford a condo, why don't you lend me some money? After all, Sylvia, we even had a child together." I replied firmly, "The only thing I'm grateful for is that I met Melody. But that's all. You left me to raise her alone and always looked down on me. The time we spent together was unbearable. Do you really think I would help you?" He persisted, "Let's put the past behind us and get back together." "Absolutely not," I said. "Besides, you're a full-time employee, right? You must be earning well compared to a part-timer like me. And if you work for a few more years, you'll get a retirement bonus, won't you?" I said firmly, "If you're getting a retirement bonus, you better use it wisely." "Well then, goodbye." I finished my point and hung up, pretending not to know about his financial troubles. I felt ashamed of having been married to him and blocked his number to prevent any more calls. About 6 months later, my daughter Melody came to stay with me. As she admired my new place, which felt a bit too spacious for just one person, she said, "Mom, I love your new place. I wish I could live in a house like this someday." I replied, "Your place is nice too. You said you liked it." "That's true, but I can't afford a room like this with my salary," she admitted, taking a sip of her after-dinner coffee and smiling. Seeing her smile brought me a sense of peace. My ex-husband was rarely mentioned between us. "Mom," Melody said, "actually, there's someone I'd like you to meet." "Oh really? You have a boyfriend?" I asked, intrigued. "What's he like?" "Well, don't laugh," she said with a chuckle. "But he's a tax attorney." I laughed. "A tax attorney? How interesting." "There's more," Melody continued. "One day I found a book on his bookshelf by the same author Grandpa used to read. I thought it was fate." I smiled warmly. What a lovely coincidence. Grandpa would be so pleased. Melody blushed slightly. I looked forward to the day when I would see her future husband standing beside her, sharing in her happiness.